thoughts on this project. Yeah, I'll be talking about life satisfaction scale. This is very much work in progress, so very early stages, and I'm hoping to present some very kind of, I hope, interesting preliminary findings, but mostly get input from the audience about how we can improve the methodology before we really crank the sample size. So the motivation for this research is broadly that, one, our ability to explain variation in life satisfaction data is, I think, quite poor. So even with machine learning stuff that Katja and Casper have done with some other colleagues, the portion of the variance that we can explain is only about 0.3. And this really says to me that there's a lot of things that are determining well-being that we're not measuring. We're not even aware that they are a thing, and we're not including them in our big social surveys. And one thing that we can do is just ask people what determines your life satisfaction, and then that can inform the kind of things we put into surveys. I think something that will hopefully help address is that at the moment, I think a lot of our research is driven by what questions are available in surveys, and we should think beyond that. So we often hear people like John Helliwell saying we need more data. Cool, but not just more life satisfaction data, more data on things that are associated with life satisfaction. And the second aspect of this research that I'm going to be talking about mostly today is the measurement side. So what are we measuring with life satisfaction scales, and how do life satisfaction scales work? So there are three assumptions that we make when doing statistical analysis with these scales. So the first is linearity, which is basically that the size of the amount of satisfaction between intervals on a life satisfaction scale, say 1 to 10, is broadly the same across intervals. Then that these scales are intertemporally consistent. So one individual uses the scale broadly the same way over time, but the qualitative meaning of the points on their scales doesn't shift really dramatically. And similarly, interpersonal consistency. So different people don't use the scale in a radically different way. Now, usually when we raise these issues, which are really important for the precision of statistical methods, we get this response from psychologists and happiness economists and pretty much everyone who works with subjective well-being data that, well, these scales are psychometrically validated. And I don't dispute that, and Casper doesn't dispute that, and I don't think anyone involved in this research really disputes that. But psychometric validity is quite different to precision. And increasingly in public policy applications especially, we are doing things with this data that requires a high degree of precision, like cost-benefit analysis. And so we should investigate to what extent are we comfortable with these assumptions, and if they are violated, how significant are those violations? Can we correct for them in some way? That sort of thing. All right. Now, in order to understand the extent to which those violations are reasonable, we need to have a better understanding of what Andrew Oswald calls the reporting function. So this is the kind of emotional, cognitive, sociological, and linguistic process by which people make life satisfaction assessments and then map those assessments into the response categories on a scale instrument. Now, there are at least 4 problems that people need to solve cognitively when they're doing this. So they need to think about what kind of lives and aspects of life they need to consider. They need to think about how to rank those different lives into an order. And then they need to think about how they map that order into the categories that are available on the scale. That will eventually give them, when they think about how their own life maps into the scale, a response category that they choose from. Now, a brief word on thinking about the reporting function. I think it is extremely difficult to unpack the reporting function, super hard. There was a very big push on it in the 1990s in psychology, in item response theory. You can look at the literature on alpha, beta, and gamma change, for example. I think that literature was broadly inconclusive, and it seems to me that since then it's been put in the too hard basket. I think part of the issue is that the methods that you need to start thinking about this are quite oblique, so they're quite unusual. They're not the kind of things that we usually do in psychology and economics. And so when people are presented this kind of research in, say, peer review, they tend to be a bit flummoxed by it, and then that makes them think that they must be crap methods. They're also legitimately quite imperfect methods. I think the thing I'm going to present to you today is also imperfect and ultimately inconclusive. So they provide some steps forward, some illumination, but not a comprehensive understanding. And so part of what we are doing in this kind of speaking tour that what Casper and I and others are doing is to just try to encourage patience from reviewers and kind of try to fertilize the soil a bit for this research. We find that this research is often treated as a threat by subjective wellbeing scholars because it makes them concerned that we're here criticizing their methods. That's not what we're doing. We are very much within the tent, but we think that mainstream economists think that these measures are kind of crap. They're very suspicious of them. And so when they see papers like the recent Bond and Lang study that seem to undermine these measures, they really jump on that and they really take it as vindication of their suspicions. And we want to say that the only way that we can get over this suspicion from mainstream economics in particular is to meet this challenge head on. So not circling the wagons around it anymore, but really taking seriously these concerns and demonstrating that they aren't that big of a deal. Now, mainstream psychologists are often not very helpful to us in this regard because, as I said, they think that this is psychometrically validated and there's nothing more for us to talk about. But actually, we think there's quite a lot to talk about. And so we'd really like to see some more respect for the kind of hard work of taking incremental steps forward on this reporting function. All right. Very briefly, a kind of model just to set the scene for those who prefer a mathematical expression. After this, I'm mostly going to be using graphics. So this is building on Oswald's model and Fleurbain and Blanchet's model in Beyond GDP, which I think is a masterpiece and everyone should read it. So the reporting function might start with people having a vector of possible lives, Li, at time t, and then their own life, Lit star. Or, and I think our research suggests that it's more this latter case, people start with a sense of their own life, Lit star, and then they come up with a vector of possible lives to compare it to. In either case, you end up with Lit star relative to a vector of possible lives, and that's really what we're interested in terms of subjective well-being. There is then this reporting function, GIT, which is a function that maps Lit star and this vector Lit into response categories on a life satisfaction scale. And then we can let RIT denote the response category to a single life satisfaction scale survey item with K responses. So what we as researchers observe, I could have sworn I fixed this, this should be a subscript. We observe RIT, which is this life satisfaction state passed through the reporting function. Now, one way of thinking about the research that we are doing, I'm very open to this way of thinking about it, is that we are trying to understand the reporting function so that we can recover that latent life satisfaction judgment. But my colleagues in medical science, in the response shift literature, they have a very different view. In their view, the reporting function and life satisfaction or subjective quality of life are one and the same thing. It's all information. You shouldn't think of the reporting function as a bias. I'm not really decided on how I think about this, but I think these are useful kind of conceptual terrain to consider. All right, now I mentioned these 4 problems that we need to solve to understand the reporting function. So the first is the scope problem. So the individual has to think about what time frame they're going to use. So are they thinking about this week? Are they thinking about the past year? Maybe their whole life and the kind of general trajectory they're on? They also need to think about whether they're just considering themselves or whether they're thinking about how society is going, how their family is going. I think this might differ across cultures. And then, of course, they have to think about what aspects of their life are relevant. And that might be very susceptible to things like focusing illusions and saliency conditions. Like when you're having a tough week at work, the general state of your work life is not going to be what comes to mind. It's going to be how things are going in that particular week. And then we want to think about how comparable responses are from the same life when different things are coming to mind. So I think it's worth pointing out in this context that, to my mind, the test-retest coefficients on life satisfaction scales are really low. So these numbers, 0.5 to 0.7 over 2 weeks, is usually listed as like a good test-retest coefficient, that there's variation here, but it's broadly tracking something stable over time. This seems very unstable to me. And so it's possible that what's going on is that different things are coming to mind of people over 2-week periods, even though their life really in meaningful terms is not changing that much. The ranking problem then is, once you've considered the scope, these things that you want to take into consideration, you need to weight the different aspects that you're taking into consideration. And then by doing that, you can order all these possible lives into a ranking. And you will probably end up with more than 10 lives to consider, even though you're mapping into a 1 to 10 scale. And then that brings you to the final step, which is the calibration problem, which is how you map life satisfaction assessments into scale response categories. And to give you an illustration of how this might cause some problems for econometrics, you might have this individual over here mapping their actual life, L star, into a 6 on the response category. And then this person over here, who is absolutely identical, except for some variation in their reporting style. Like, for example, they're extroverted, whereas this person's introverted. They have the same life, they're otherwise the same person. And this person will map that same L star into an 8, right? And then we will be assuming that this person's life is better than this person's life, but actually what's different is the reporting style. And here I think it raises again this question from the medical people about whether the reporting style is fundamentally part of your subjective well-being or whether they are distinguishable. I think it's worth mentioning that there are a bunch of vignette studies like Ari Kaptein's work and Angelini et al., and more recently Mallory Montgomery, who's doing work on gender, that show that there are these kind of seemingly differences in the way different groups report their life satisfaction. So in Kaptein and Angelini's work, once you use vignettes to imperfectly, but to some extent, control for differences in calibration style, the differences in financial satisfaction between Dutch people and Americans disappear. That's in Kaptein's work. And then in Montgomery's work, the difference in life satisfaction between men and women that seems to be driven by gender doesn't disappear, but shrinks very substantially. All right. One way that these differences in reporting style can manifest that I think can be a bit problematic, and this is what got me into this research originally, is that I felt like this described what I was doing, and that made me worried, is what we call ceiling effects. So let me explain the graph. So on the x-axis, you have waves of an annual survey like the SOAP or the UK's Understanding Society. On the y-axis, you have life satisfaction, this vector, so running from 0 to infinity. It's not really clear that putting numbers on it is reasonable, but for the purposes of illustration, I think it makes things a lot clearer. The red bars are then the actual scales that this person is using each wave, running from 1 to 10. And then the black line running across is the person's latent life satisfaction over time. So you can see that in the first wave, the person's latent life satisfaction is a 7 out of 10. They can report that quite easily on the scale. That's what they give you. Then it rises slightly to an 8 out of 10. Again, they can report that, no dramas. In the third wave, though, their life satisfaction continues to rise. And now their level of life satisfaction is equivalent to 10 out of 10 on their original survey, original scale, sorry. But they don't want to tell you that their life is perfect. They're perfectly satisfied. Nothing could improve, right? So instead of changing their response category from 8 to 10, they instead change the nature of the scale that they're using. And so again, as a researcher, we would be misled to think that this person's life satisfaction is not improving at times 2, 3, and 4, but actually it's increasing markedly. It's just that the nature of their reporting style is changing. But we can't assess that unless we have some auxiliary questions in the survey in order to try to tease the stuff apart. There is some empirical evidence for this kind of phenomenon from Corke and Perino's paper from 2015 that I think remains still unpublished, oddly, where they compare life satisfaction responses to a question like, do you prefer your life today than a year ago? So a lot of people would say, yes, I do prefer my life today compared to a year ago, but there's no change in their life satisfaction scale. And I also have a paper in the Journal of Happiness Studies where I ask a similar thing where people plot their life satisfaction over the last 10 years. And I find some quite bizarre behavior, like some people who say that their life has gotten worse in terms of their scale responses, but who plot their life going up and vice versa. So a lot of things here that we could look into. All right, this background information leads to 3 important concepts: scale norming, adaptation, and reference points shifts, that I think is worth teasing apart. And then I'll get into the research that we're doing to try to take these issues further. So the first concept I want to delineate is scale norming. So scale norming is where the reporting style that a person has changes over time, independently of their underlying life satisfaction. So in this case on the graph, you can see that this person's life satisfaction doesn't change at all. What changes is their reporting style, right? So their scale is shifting. We as the researchers might think there's a lot of volatility in their life satisfaction, but actually the volatility is in their reporting style. So there is no change of feelings here. Now, I think there is, again, like decades of empirical evidence for this sort of thing from this response shift studies literature in medical science, but they have quite a different paradigm for thinking about it that I can't really explain in the time I have available today. But I just want to say that this isn't kind of purely a theoretical claim. There is some verification of it. Then we have adaptation, which I think most people are quite well familiar with in this literature, which is a real change in feelings. So an acclimatization to some shock over time. Maybe you become disabled or you get a facial scar, but you get used to it. And so by the time we get back to time 5, this initial shock bringing us down to a 3, we've recovered from that. This reporting style is the same. So the scales don't shift and they don't stretch either, which is another way of thinking about it. Instead, it's the latent life satisfaction that is improving. Now, I think a key issue is that we cannot distinguish adaptation from scale norming in the raw data. And a lot of the literature that we have on adaptation assumes that the entire effect is explained by adaptation. But in many cases, the effect might actually be explained by scale norming, and that has differences for our policy conclusions. And then finally, the one I think is really problematic, a real headache, is reference point shifts. So this is a change in response style that leads to a change in your feelings. Now, you might think that's fanciful, like that's completely unrealistic. But actually, this is exactly how gratitude works. So gratitude is a fairly well-established idea in psychological science that if you can get people to think about the things in their life that are positive, then they will feel better. So you're changing the reporting style, and that leads to a change in feelings. And this again raises this question of, well, is the reporting style distinct from the subjective well-being, or is it actually part of it? Again, I think indistinguishable from scale norming and adaptation in the raw data. So we need some auxiliary questions. All right. Yeah.
Just a couple of slides ago about one more. Oh, wait, yeah, sorry, next one.
Yeah.
Can you give an example? Because I'm trying to understand how that differentiates from the gratitude thing. So why would there be a change in reported style? For example, say experience, or that would be the same again as adaptation.
Yeah, so one would be that like in the Cantrell's ladder, for example, the 10 category is the best possible life for you. Mm-hmm. And in one stage, someone might have a very realistic notion of what's best possible for them. So I don't know, like getting promoted a couple more steps up in my firm. And in another case, their best possible life for them might be something much more fanciful, like becoming a rock star or winning the lottery or something like that. And that would mean, I think in that case, what you'd actually get is not so much a shift in the scale, but a stretch in the scale. So the 10 would be higher, and that would make things look different.
But this implies that it's not linked to, so I thought that this is not linked with how they actually feel about the situation. But if I compare myself with a person 2 positions above and I compare myself to a rock star, I might feel differently about that.
Yeah, they might. But I guess I'm talking about a situation where they assess their life exactly the same way. They just map it into a different response category because the categories have been stretched out by the fact that the top category is being Jeff Bezos rather than being promoted in my firm, something like that. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so how can we proceed? So Casper and I, in partnership with Alberto and Eileen Tipo and Michael Plant and a bunch of other people, because we're trying to get more and more discourse around these issues, have been trying to come up with some methodologies by which we can take incremental steps on this stuff. Some of them are cross-sectional, some of them are longitudinal. The one I'm going to present today is a qualitative methodology, namely cognitive interviewing, which is basically where we ask people to think out loud about their life satisfaction while they answer a life satisfaction scale question and various follow-up questions. All right, so basically we are hoping to interview about 400 residents of the United Kingdom specifically, so a very relatively narrow cultural slice of the global population. The objective here is conceptual saturation. So in qualitative work, it's not about getting a representative sample because then you would just end up with a lot of duplication and that's not very interesting for what we're trying to do. What we're trying to get is a broad sense of the different ways that people might solve this reporting function and what sort of issues we might want to be attentive to as we move into the cross-sectional and longitudinal work where we intend to use representative samples. Now, as I mentioned, pretty early stages, we've only done about 10% of the interviews so far, partially for funding reasons, but that should be resolved next week. So we're going to kick off again. The interviews take about 30 to 40 minutes. We pay people about £12 for their time. So that includes a bit of administrative work before and after doing the actual interview. So far, our sample is, I think, remarkably diverse, better than I expected, on age, gender and sexuality, income, occupation and education. But so far, we are not at all diverse on race and culture or on rural metropolitan divisions, although we're getting a bit better on regional and kind of peri-urban stuff. Our recruitment methodology is pretty crude. Started with just kind of word of mouth, like tapped people that we knew and asked them if they could think of anyone unusual or different to them that would like to participate in the research. Once we interview someone, we always ask them if they know someone who's kind of markedly different to them and might be interested in participating in the research. Could they pass our contact details on to that person? And we usually get a couple of rounds of snowballing and then it stops and we have to pursue some other avenue. We have some partner organizations that have mailing lists that we go to. We have some panels that our universities have to recruit people for experiments. We're using those as well, all sorts of stuff. But broadly, we look at what kind of demographic qualities we haven't got yet in the sample, and we try to recruit that in. So be interested if anyone has any suggestions on recruitment. All right, to give you a sense for the kind of questions we ask, we open with a bunch of questions about the scope. So we ask people either the Office of National Statistics' life satisfaction question or the Cantrell's ladder question, kind of randomly decide. Then we ask them what determines their life satisfaction, and we tend to converse with them on that for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, right? So we really give them an opportunity to tell us in very broad strokes, deep texture, what life is about for them. And then we ask them questions about whether they're feeling any emotions right now or any events that have happened recently that might affect their answer, what time frame they kind of had in mind. They'll often come out in the discussion, whether they consider their family or how their society's going, or they think just about themselves. And then we ask them what they think satisfied means. So some people are concerned that satisfied isn't all that positive a term, that, you might interpret that a bit negatively, like, yeah, my life is kind of bog standard or whatever. I haven't really found that, but we ask them what they mean by satisfied, and we ask them what best and worst possible means. So how do they interpret that word possible? And then we ask a bit about the role of projects and goals. Then we sort of flag to them that we're now going to transition more towards how they use the scale. A lot of our early interviews, people got kind of annoyed by these scale questions. They found them really onerous and just kind of, irritating. So now we sort of try to shepherd them into that period, and that has resulted in people taking the questions much more amicably. So we asked them things like, okay, you said you were 7 out of 10. What does 5 out of 10 mean to you? What kind of life would you need to be living to give us a 5 out of 10? What about 9 out of 10? We asked them about the top and the bottom of the scales so that we can get a sense for that, and also try to calibrate the midpoint on the scale, which is important for some statistical questions. We asked them whether the meaning of those points has changed over time. That tends to come out in the conversation, and how frequently it changes. And then we asked them what sort of change it would take in their life to shift them up or down 1 point. And then that leads into this question, which I think is the most powerful question for the statistical issues that we're exploring. And we hope to use a lot of the insights from these cognitive interviews to roll this out in a more representative, large online sample. So when Casper came up with these images, when we first started thinking about this, I was like, there is no way that we would be able to kind of get people to understand what we mean here. But actually, having done a few of the interviews and kind of learned better in what order to explain things, I'm now finding that most people are really comfortable with this question. They do think it's a reasonable way of expressing what they're doing. Maybe about 10% of the sample, maybe less even, think that this is completely off on the wrong pattern. So we basically start by saying, okay, so the black line here is your life satisfaction from low to high. The dot represents your current, or this respondent's current level of life satisfaction. And then the brackets are the points on the scale. And you can see that here, there's the same increment of life satisfaction between the different points on the scale. We always start with linearity. We want to prime people for linearity. So I'm not trying to shepherd people away from the assumption that subjective wellbeing scholars make. I'm trying to shepherd them towards that assumption. But then we say maybe there's some other ways that you could think about it. So you might have small increments around your level of satisfaction, wide increments elsewhere, might be just kind of uneven, might really depend on the kind of life you associate with each of these numbers, or you might have kind of concave or convex reporting styles. And as I say, most people, yeah.
I feel not, I mean, sort of, I feel not try to randomize those, and I feel not try to like let them come up with a scaling themselves in some of them, so where they can basically, you know, draw it themselves.
So we intend to roll that out in the online platforms. So just because of, like we could solve the randomization problem, but I basically just screen share this image and then talk them through it, and that makes it a bit hard to randomize it. But yeah, definitely the objective is to put this into a survey platform and then let them get to choose it. Yeah.
So I think my question related to that question is like when you force people to think through the skills,
yeah,
and like ask them about different skills, does that change people's perception or anything more? Maybe become different in the way they react?
Yeah, interestingly, no. So I thought it would. The last question that we ask in the survey is, you know, given all the conversations we've had and the images I've shown you, are you thinking about your life differently, how you use the scale differently, and do you want to change your answer? And only one person of the 39 we've interviewed so far has said yes. And the only thing they wanted to change was their answer, not how they thought about life satisfaction or anything like that. One thing we did get was, and I think I'll talk about this a bit later, is that some people, when they first see this, they think that they're linear, but as they think about it more, they realize that there's something different. And then one person discovered that she was this, and that was kind of irrational or inconsistent with some of her other answers. And she really panicked at that stage. And I was like, it's not a problem. Like that, I kind of expect this sort of thing. So don't worry about that. But she really did kind of acknowledge that there was some problem in her reporting. All right.
I think we had a question online. Was there a question online, or it was an accidental sound? I guess that was an accidental sound. Sorry.
All right. So let me start with some encouraging findings, and then I'll get to the ones that are maybe a bit more concerning. So the first thing to note is that people do seem to really reflect just everyone. 100% of respondents thought about themselves, not about other people or society or whatever. I suspect that would be different in other cultures, but in the UK, that seems to be how it works. They typically think that society is doing worse than they are, like 2 points worse than they are. I think that raises interesting policy questions, like if the objective of policy is just about welfare maximization and we proxy that with life satisfaction, but people also care about social justice or something, then maybe we need to supplement that. People interpret possible very realistically. So I haven't had anyone say that 10 is being Jeff Bezos or something like that. They tend to have quite reasonable possibles in mind. Some people more ambitious than others. People's emotions and recent events don't seem to affect their answer, which I think is encouraging from a cognitive biases point of view. Sometimes this is almost worrying. Like I've had 2 respondents, one whose mother was hospitalized 3 days prior and one whose dad had had a heart attack 48 hours prior. And I was like, has that sort of affected your response? They're like, nah. And I was like, hey, maybe it should.
But do you think if you actually asked them 2 days ago their life satisfaction and today, they would not change it? So is it that it does not affect, or is it that they don't perceive, they cannot distinguish within their reports what's?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so both of them had cancelled their interviews from the prior days when the incident occurred. So it seems to me like they were distressed on that day in some way. Yeah. And then I would more interpret it as like people think that when you ask them about their life satisfaction, they should control their emotions and try to give you a broader picture. That's kind of my reading on it at the moment. But I think the sample size is too small. And I didn't interview them on the specific day when it happened. Yeah, Chris?
I like these encouraging findings.
Yeah.
But some of them are at odds with the literature, right? I mean, the Benjamin et al. Paper recently found that people actually think quite about their surroundings, their surroundings. And usually people think better of themselves. That's the best And usually people, I mean, emotions actually do matter quite a lot for the current scale.
Yeah,
And it's often used as an instrument that, you know, somebody died, and that's is an instrument for a lower life satisfaction, and sort of the emotional literature. If something happened to you shortly before taking the survey, that sort of like has been shown to matter. So can you explain why?
Yeah. So a couple of quick points. So whether they say the emotion affects them or not is different from whether it does or not. So they might not realize it. The second thing is that I think the sort of emotional heuristic view is still kind of alive and well in our literature. So people who are generally experiencing more positive emotions in their life will use that as a heuristic for their answer, but they won't necessarily be. I think the way our question is phrased and the way people are taking it is whether something's really weighing on your mind right now. So the idea I have in mind is like you missed the bus on the way here or something, and you're really pissed off about that, or you've got a deadline tomorrow and you're really stressed about that sort of thing. I think broadly though, the people who have a lot of negative emotion in their lives, so a lot of the early sample came from an anti-poverty charity. So we had a lot of people with quite rough lives in the sample. They definitely have a lot of negative experiences, and that's definitely colouring their life satisfaction assessments. And then, yeah, broadly, I think, yeah, these results concur with the literature, and that's good. I mean, I think that's why it's encouraging. Like if we take a different tact on revealing what subjective well-being is than just looking at life satisfaction data and trying to backfit it, we instead asked what determines your life, we get some confluence, which I take to be a good thing. Yeah. Okay, cool. As I said, people don't seem to change their scores much after deliberation, which I think is cool, or their understanding of best possible. All right. On to some of the more kind of, I don't know about concerning, but just kind of interesting stuff that we should pursue further. So I think the first one is that, so my co-author Casper has this paper in PNAS that just came out showing that in the aggregate, people seem to use the scale very linearly. So we're not here to smash that idea, but people don't seem to express themselves as using the scale linearly. So all sorts of shapes come out of this one. So every one of these is represented except, except this one. I haven't got this one yet. And the most common one is something like this. So small increments of satisfaction to move around your current level. Only 3 of the respondents said that they're linear. 2 of them were doctors, 1 was an engineer. 1 of them explicitly said, well, that just seems like the only rational way to use these scales, which I thought was quite an interesting statement. 4 of the respondents said at first that they were linear, but once they sort of thought about it a bit and talked to me about it and all the things that they'd said earlier in the interview, they realized, and all of them said the same thing, which is maybe interesting, that they had skinny middles and wide tails. So that's a bit different to this. This implies that as your level of satisfaction shifts, so will the shape of your scale, whereas this one is more fixed, but it does suggest skinny in the middle and fat at the ends. We're still working through the math of this, but we think that this is quite compatible with seeming linearity in the aggregate, even if individuals are not using it linearly over time. Yeah.
Is it just because people are more precise about where they are? So if I say that my life is 6 and I'm in this moment, I have kind of lower standard error of what is 6 and higher standard errors on what is 2, which looks exactly like you. It's just uncertainty that whatever that life of 2 is, that's why it's wider.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Well, I think that explains most of what we're observing is uncertainty and people kind of hedging their scale around that uncertainty. And then I think that raises interesting questions about longitudinal comparability of responses as people's lives change and that uncertainty reduces. So as I said, this is basically what got me into this research, is that I thought I wanted an academic career, and as I started to hit milestones, my life got more satisfied and ambiguity disappeared. And I was like, I don't really think I can report these changes consistently on my own scale. Are other people dealing with that same problem? Okay. So could this sort of stuff bias our econometric estimates? My suspicion is yes. And then the question is sort of to what extent? So here are 2 people with that linear style that I mentioned. So assume that everyone has that style, which is not what we observed. But even if everyone did, might still be problematic. So you could think of this either as two people with this same reporting style but different satisfaction, or the same person over time with the same reporting style but different satisfaction at the different points in time. So you see that the dot moves up the latent life satisfaction in the second graphic. Here they have this satisfaction, they say that they're 5, then their satisfaction improves and they say that they're a 6. So as a researcher, you would observe correctly that their life satisfaction has improved. And we don't think that there's really any way that this could result in sign reverses. So we don't need to be worried about the stuff that Bond and Lang talk about. At the same time, this second scale, you see that the 4 is higher than the 5 from the previous scale. And that suggests to me that there's probably some bias in the way we aggregate across a statistical estimator for what effect is going on. But we still need to work through the math of that to figure out what the problem is.
Are you consciously making an assumption that the worst possible and the best possible stay in place? Because these two scales look like you just squeeze and extend 1 to 10,
yes,
but the ages are fixed. Is it conscious?
Yeah, really good point. And I know it was a kind of oversight on my part. So this whole slide deck, I haven't got stretching anywhere.
Okay.
But I think stretching is definitely a possibility. And we need to sort of think more through that. Yeah. I think for illustrative purposes, I've kept them fixed, but you might have different situations. Yeah, Chris?
I mean, econometrically, if you include individual fixed effects,
Yeah.
that should take care of like a time invariant reporting function,
Yeah.
right? So it's still not a big problem if you have panel data and individual fixed effects. I think it becomes a problem if people change their reporting function and sort of like become more widely spread. I think also that people, if they're really sort of so close around the point at which they are right now, make the difference smaller. I think it's actually, as Katja said, it's probably uncertainty, and we can just imagine more, things that are incremental changes to our lives. But it's probably always in every stage of life like that.
Yeah.
I think it remains like this, that we're just much better to imagine, okay, what happens if my car breaks down, rather than, okay, what happens if I lose my house? So it's always like these small things which are much better. So it's probably remaining fairly constant over time. Even for you, probably it's fairly constant. Now you're an academic, but a professorship in 10 years, might be very different. And so there might be more uncertainty. Now you know what happens with teaching next week. So there's more. Yeah.
I think having kids is probably the instructive one for me. So I think that's very much on the horizon. And I think it might be quite a structural break in my life satisfaction and also in my reporting style. Particularly how I think the way I think of lives in scope at the moment will be totally different once I have kids. Yeah.
This question is like the reporting function, does that relate to the age? For example, because in some economic literature, we just exclude some examples from like above 75 or above 70, because that function is very different from actually the middle age or young people.
So in our results, the retirees seem to interpret the satisfied with your life question as whether they are satisfied with how their life went. Whereas younger people seem to interpret it as how their life is going. And these seem to me like kind of different constructs. So I don't want to read too much into this, but I think maybe some part of the U-shaped curvature is driven by this effect. So this big upswing among the elderly is because they look back in a way where they're like, well, I can't change anything. So given what I know now, like, how did it go? Like, yeah, it went pretty well. Yeah.
You see some like myopic, like more myopic way of interpreting the life satisfaction in the older people.
What do you mean by myopic?
For example, they care more about like what's happened to the world, what happened like around that time, but younger people probably look forward to 5-10 years or.
Good question. Good question. Not temporally myopic. I would more say that the scope changes. So, but maybe this is just sample selection at the moment, but I find that the older people I talk to are much more relational and much more, I think the word is generative, like they kind of care about how their social relations are going and what they're doing to contribute to that. And I think that works for evolutionary reasons as well, but I don't need to get into that. Alberto, do you have a question?
Yeah, just an intuition, which is probably good news. So a way of thinking of linearity is, does the movement that I need in lattice satisfaction to move from 5 to 6 is the same for moving from 6 to 7? If in this case, yes, the answer is yes.
Right.
So it's actually poses no problem to linearity if there is no scale shifts of things.
Yeah, I think that's
it's
right.
actually better. It's a better news than how it was.
Yeah. So yeah, broadly, that was kind of my suspicion as well, is that actually this won't be a problem. But we need to sit down and just show it formally.
We have a question online from Chris. Chris?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, hi. I was going to keep this till the end, but we're getting into details. So I've been wondering why you're using a 1 to 10 scale. The ONS4 and Gallup adhere to the OECD recommendation for 0 to 10.
Okay, I mean, so basically because I originally got into this research using Hilda, and Hilda is 1 to 10. But do you think it would make a market difference?
Well, not sure my opinion on that matters. I do think it's, I do think it's different, especially when you're talking about the middle of the scale.
Oh yeah.
Mine is not the middle of the scale on yours. But anyway, you just said that you were using the ONS one. This is not actually the ONS scale.
Yeah, I'll double check that. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
While I'm speaking, I'll just chime in maybe on this. I don't think that if older people reflect that their answer is dominated by their life so far, I'm not sure that's necessarily a different construct. I think we have mental capital we build up. In other words, good memories continue to produce benefits in the future, and the opposite for bad. And so the share of that is higher for people who are older. Childhood events don't just shape you; they also continue to affect your mental state and your satisfaction. Throughout life. So you could say that that's something you should leave up to individuals rather than saying it's a different concept. But that's maybe one of these questions which is not really a falsifiable proposition in this field.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing we could do is ask in a follow-up sample or something, some young people, like on the online panels, we could ask younger people, how satisfied are you with how your life has gone up to this point? And see whether that changes the results compared to if we ask them just how satisfied they are with their life. If we have this assumption that the younger people are thinking about it more in terms of how it's going than how it has gone, if that makes sense. I think we can. I have no axe to grind in this fight. I think it would be interesting to explore.
By the way, do you explicitly ask people at the end of each interview if they want to change their answer?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Another important finding, I think, is that almost all the respondents, like 90% or more, explicitly said that they would never give a 10 out of 10. Maybe they would give it for an hour or two at a time, and that they can't really see themselves even giving a 9 out of 10 for more than a couple of days at a time, typically around major achievements. Interestingly, those who do say that they could see themselves giving these high scores, or they are already giving these high scores, tend to have very modest lives in mind. So I'll just give you an example. One guy I interviewed who was a kind of senior nurse in the NHS, he was like, yeah, I'm like a 9 out of 10 right now. I had divorced my wife a few years ago, but it's all quite amicable, and the kids are well and everything. And I've just kind of semi-retired, so I'm able to access my pension, and while still working, so my income is a little bit more comfortable now. And I've paid for an apartment that's being built that I'm going to move into in 2 years' time when it's finished, and then I will be 10 out of 10. And I think that's a very different kind of thing than what we might associate with 10 out of 10. And I haven't checked this myself, but Claudia Senek told me recently that in the big social surveys, it's also the case that the people reporting 10 out of 10 tend not to be quite as wealthy in particular as we might expect for someone giving a 10 out of 10. So that's consistent, and it's also consistent with this rash analysis from Schutz et al. That people seem to use scales in a very sensible and consistent way up till about 8 out of 10. And then after 8 out of 10, things seem to get a bit weird. And it's not really clear from their analysis what's going on with that weirdness, what's driving it, but it seems strange.
I definitely would consider cultural differences there.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, maybe the British, maybe a little bit more, not think to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like someone from an Asian culture might be like, oh, like I'm a six, and
Yeah.
not really dare to.
Yeah, so at the Oxford conference, this guy made this very astute point. He's a Japanese guy, and he said that in Japan, the idea of a good life is one in which you are balanced, not in which you're maximizing. And so he would not expect Japanese people to think of like being a 10 as optimal. So definitely when we finish this project, I mean, I hope we create some buzz and then we can get people in other countries to replicate what we're doing and we get some interesting cross-cultural stuff. So in terms of some policy implications of this, so yeah.
There might also not, I'm really not, I mean, maybe also in Asia, what I've read is that there is some sort of like, it's not something you do to report that you're too happy.
Yeah.
It's something, maybe sort of more like a social convention, it's not even the reporting function, I think. It's something that's sort of like, it's even if the reporting function is sort of like an additional function wrapped. Sort of
social desirability.
Convention of reporting. Yeah, it's something you don't do.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether to fold social desirability into the reporting function or not. Something to think about. Okay, so according to the 2018 annual population survey of the UK average is 7.7 out of 10. And that suggests to me that, well, if people don't want to say that they're 9 or 10, then thinking of this as like our primary measure of progress might be setting ourselves up for failure. Like we just might not have enough sensitivity in the measure for this to give us what we're looking for. I think perhaps a more important implication of this is that interventions targeted at people with a baseline high level of life satisfaction might seem to not have much of an effect, but it's just because people don't have space in their scale to report it. If you ask them directly, as in that Corke and Perino paper, are you more satisfied with your life after the treatment? They might say yes. And then we worry that that's just recall bias or effort justification or whatever it might be. But in any case, that concerns me a little bit. And equally, we would expect then treatments on people who have a low baseline to potentially show up much more of an effect just because they have space to move into. So for example, migrants from Tonga into New Zealand, who are almost all affluent, you have to be affluent to get into New Zealand, start with high baselines and don't report much change in their life satisfaction when they get to New Zealand, but they do seem to show signs of scale norming. Whereas migrants from, I think, Sierra Leone into Canada, that were studied in the World Happiness Report, they go so high, but that's because they start at 5 and they go up to 8, instead of the Tongans who go from 8 to 8, if that makes sense. Right? Yeah.
Are you saying that for the policy purposes, we should choose a question of whether your life today is better than before, not? Because we've seen from Alberta's work that the answers are not very much in line.
No, the answer is yes.
That the answer are not in line, yes, but then.
So I'd like to have auxiliary questions. I think that's kind of where my research is going. We haven't thought about yet what the best auxiliary questions would be, but that just using life satisfaction means that we might be misled in these kind of cases. And I'm just raising that as a concern for now. Yeah.
So I think based on what we just found now, is it possible that the scale is asymmetric across income distribution for wealthier people? They have longer tail at the right end, like more packed at the right end. So it means they know exactly when they are very bad. They know, but for the very like good part, it's hard for them to imagine exactly.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But for poor people, they have long tailed left end, very packed right end. So now the scale you use is symmetrically like stretched, but it could be asymmetrically stretched towards one end.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that would be consistent with my limited interviews so far. Yeah, that a lot of the kind of more bourgeois people that we've interviewed, they've never experienced suffering, so they don't know what that's like. I don't know how to say that really. So most of them are really aware of that. They're like, look, my life has been super privileged. It's been great. I don't have anything bad to say. Age changes the construct. So interestingly, most of the people I talk to aren't materialistic. I haven't come across anyone yet who's like, oh, I just need more money. The people who say they need more money, it's because they feel extremely constrained in their situation. So this woman said, I don't want holidays in Monaco or whatever it is that rich people do. People want enough money to feel secure in their lives and to facilitate some of the dynamic things that they think would bring richness to their life, like coffee with friends, contributing to their household and their families, attending interesting events, that sort of thing. If they don't have the money and the health and these kind of basic needs to do that stuff, that has a very profound negative effect. But I think once you relieve that constraint, they still seem to have a further question about what it is that they want to do with their life. And that's a whole nother puzzle. All right, in terms of what people say well-being is, a summary statement would be something like a secure, steady state, and then projects that keep life dynamic, engaging, and exciting. And I think we do quite a good job of measuring that steady state in social surveys, maybe not so much on the relationships front, but we're getting better, but we do quite a bad job of measuring this dynamic aspects, things about projects and altruism and meaning in life and why that meaning in life is and where it comes from, that sort of thing. Most of the people seem to be either very goal-oriented or very relational. And then everyone has a bit of both, but it seems to kind of flip-flop one way or the other. Some of the well-being drivers that people emphasize, but that aren't in surveys. So they are in the European Social Survey Wellbeing module from 2012, but that's pretty much the only one. And I just led a team to try to get that module repeated. We'll see how we go. So things like access to therapy, and typically that means much more than cognitive behavioral therapy, having projects and goal achievement, big one, the quality of relationships, so not just the number, but how effective they are. Family relationships specifically seems to exert a really outsized influence. As I said, enough money and health to do the things that you want, rather than thinking of it as a kind of linear relationship. A clear sense of self and identity. I don't think we measure that at all. Self-esteem and pride in self. A sense that you're on a positive trajectory. Maybe we can sort of get there with optimism. Trauma is a huge thing, but maybe a bit of a sample selection bias for me. And then basic psychological needs. So these notions of autonomy, competence, and relatedness that come out of this theory, which is hugely influential in social psychology, are very omnipresent in what people say, even if they don't explicitly mention them. So I think we really should start measuring that more. All right, let me wrap up. So a big takeaway for me is that actually people's responses are very rational, maybe not rational the way economists mean, but I mean like very sensible. They are very sensical statements. People know what they're talking about. People are trying their best to express themselves on these instruments. I think it's very dangerous for us to think about these people as being cognitively biased. There's an enormous amount of heterogeneous complexity in people's lives that they are trying to cram into this number. And it's very hard for them to do that over time, especially. And I think it's a bit naive of researchers to think people don't know what they're talking about. They're fully cognitively biased. We just get the number and then we're going to run some regressions and figure out what causes this number. I don't think we need to do that. I think we can just ask people what causes their well-being, and we can work from both directions. The causal pathways about how these things, for example, affect well-being are very complicated. They tend to pass through a lot of mediators. And so I don't think we should be chauvinistic about quantitative methods. And I don't think we should be quick to assume that the biases that we seem to observe are in the people as opposed to in the instrument that we're using. I think this is a real technocratic conceit, and it could land us in a lot of hot water. All right, so I'm keen to hear ways to improve the study. I think we really need to take the peculiarities of the reporting function and scale use seriously rather than circling the wagons around this. We've got to ask about the precision of these instruments, not just their validity. I think qualitative research can inform the interpretation of a lot of our quantitative results, especially when we're in tricky situations. And they can give us very rich hypotheses about what is causing well-being that we can then treat with randomized controlled trials and this kind of stuff to get more certainty in our understanding. I think we need to acknowledge that life satisfaction scales are very useful in a lot of practical contexts, but also highly reductive. And so we need to think about where they are most profitably applied rather than having a kind of totalizing attitude where they are our first and foremost and overwhelmingly the instrument that we use. We can use a lot of other stuff. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. We have a few minutes left and we have two questions. One is from the chat and one is by Chris, and the one from the chat arrived earlier. So sorry, Chris, if you don't mind, you would be next. if the size of the intervals reflect someone's sense of extent of change required to move from the current score, isn't that consistent?
What do you mean by consistent, Meryl?
Apologies, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not Meryl. This is my boss is Meryl.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Sure.
accidentally logged into her Zoom. So my name's Georgina. Yeah, I was just thinking about the bias that you were talking about, and I just sorry, don't come from the same background that you're coming at this from. So it didn't feel that it was a huge bias or inconsistency, that if people are thinking about the size of those intervals in terms of the change required, rather than necessarily the gap between 4 and 5 is a lot bigger than the gap between 5 and 6. It's simply that I'm in 6. So I just wasn't quite sure that that inconsistency was quite the way you described it.
Okay. I'm not. I guess I'm not just sure what you're saying, but I guess one way I'm thinking about it is that I'm very reluctant to call anything in here a bias or inconsistency. Like, so as I said, I think people are trying really, really hard to express themselves accurately in a way that researchers can understand. The inconsistency is more like when we plug this data into regressions and statistical models, if we do that naively, so we're not aware of what's going on in the way people are trying to communicate, do we ever get some imprecision in the estimates that we get out of those models? And as I said, I think a lot of this research is kind of preliminary at the moment, so we haven't really worked through the math to see how bad the problem is, but I have some suspicions about where that misestimation might sneak in. And that's kind of more where I'm coming from. Yeah. Thanks.
We're going to take a question from Chris, and I'm afraid that's going to be the last question. If anyone would to contact Mark.
Anyone, yeah, email me. I'm very chatty. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I see time's really up. Actually, now I'm inspired by not Meryl, was it Georgina's question? It sounds like she's saying people may be evaluating either the difficulty or cost or probability of moving along a scale, if rather than difference, in other words, external circumstances rather than differences in experience. If that was the case, you might expect that mapping just to look like the distribution, people's belief about the population distribution of life satisfaction. It's unlikely to get out to the 10s and the 1s because most people are in the middle, and that would really not reflect their experience, but the likely outcomes based on what's out there. I'm really interested by your last slide of warnings about life satisfaction and how to, in light of the fact that we know of problems with affective forecasting, and there's plenty of literature from life satisfaction showing that people are making mistakes in terms of their decisions, but the affective forecasting speaks most to me. So people, there's no reason why somebody should know what alternative lives are like, and therefore know what it is that is that could change their life satisfaction, or how much different things could change their satisfaction, better than data from millions of people. People are expert in principle on what they've experienced, and not on all the paths they haven't. So I'm also leery. I think going from these things at both sides is great. I'm very excited that there's a flourishing of work in understanding these distributions and mapping, but I don't think it's right to believe that people are experts on the lives they haven't lived.
Okay, yeah. Like, point taken. I guess to my mind, there's very few people in this space representing my view, which is that you should radically take people's judgments seriously. I think there's a very strong group of people advocating the cognitive biases point of view. And I guess I'm in that broad space, very much on Giga Renz's team, that there is a bias in social and cognitive psychology, where everything is perceived to be a bias. There's not much thinking about what the bias is from. So in economics, we have this very niche notion of the bias where we think of an optimal gamble, and then how far people's, say, pension investments deviate from an optimal gambling decision. But in the context of how people are thinking about their well-being, I don't think that framework maps on very well. I have much less confidence than you in the affective forecasting literature, because it's so much driven by life satisfaction stuff. And I've raised a bunch of issues about why intertemporal comparability of life satisfaction responses might not be straightforward. So it's not clear to me that people do have that much of an affective forecasting bias. It might be that they're really struggling to communicate changes in their life satisfaction over time to a respondent, to a researcher on this particular scale. But I totally take your point that I shouldn't be too gung-ho about the idea that we can just trust people's own opinion. We should kind of triangulate what's going on using a range of data points, research methodologies, conceptual frameworks, that sort of thing. I think that's good.
Thank you, Mark. I hate to interrupt this very interesting conversation, but we ran out of time. So let me wrap up, and then if somebody wants to stay online or in person and continue chatting to Mark, if Mark is
I'm happy
to
to stay. Yeah.
Great. Then
Jonathan, I can send the slides. That's fine.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Join us next week. That's going to be the last Wellbeing seminar this semester. And thank you, Mark.
Is it in person?
Yes.